Chris Miller was used to relying on his wife when doing business. Ashley studied economics at the local university and was known to be one of the best students of her year. Thus, whenever Chris needed qualified help or advice, he always turned to his wife. Really, if it weren't for Ashley, Chris's business would have failed very early on. Their family life could be considered great if it weren't for Chris's peculiarity. For some inexplicable reason, he enjoyed making fun of his wife. At first, his jokes were quite innocent, but then they became more and more unpleasant in time. Chris could easily tell his wife that she didn't need to buy a dress, as she could just wear a bathrobe at home. Chris's favorite phrase was, "Why do you need makeup? We need someone ugly in our family." Of course, such comments upset Ashley and left a bitter aftertaste in her soul. Nevertheless, she always forgave her husband in the hopes that he wouldn't behave like that again. But before long, Chris took up the old habits again. The worst part was that over time, his jokes became more crude and offensive. At first glance, it seemed that there was nothing special about them. But if one were to think about it, it was obvious that every single one of Chris's comments was aimed at asserting himself at someone else's expense. In the depths of her soul, Ashley understood it, but she tried not to focus on it, hoping that her husband would change one day. That day, as she was getting ready for the family celebration, Ashley tried to only think of the good. Quite expectedly, the young woman was responsible for organizing the event, which they decided to hold at the restaurant. Since the guest list turned out to be quite impressive, Ashley needed to make sure to pre-order enough food for everyone. It wasn't only the relatives of the Miller couple who got invited to such celebrations, but their friends too. Some of them Ashley was glad to see, others not so much, but overall it was a nice group of people. The best part for the young woman was that her best friend Diana promised to attend the celebration. They had been friends since childhood and trusted each other with their most intimate secrets. Diana was one of the very few people who knew about Ashley's problems with her husband and insisted that putting up with the way he was treating Ashley was simply unacceptable. "You can't let him treat you this way. It won't take him long to cross the line," Diana said. At such moments, Ashley tried to change the topic of the conversation because she always found talking about it very uncomfortable. Unfortunately, that day's celebration didn't make an exception. When all the guests gathered at the restaurant, Chris did what he was best at, made a sarcastic comment which was primarily aimed at making fun of Ashley. "At least the food here was good. The meat is moderately fried, and most importantly, they didn't use too many spices, because my wife always either burns her meat or oversalts it," Chris said, taking a sip of wine from his glass. Her husband's words made Ashley blush. She knew perfectly well that Chris was lying, and he did that with the sole purpose of humiliating her. The truth was that Ashley was an excellent cook and never once burned her meat or used too much salt on it. When they were home alone, Chris turned into a different person. He was calm and reasonable most of the time. However, as soon as the couple went out together, Chris turned into some kind of a stand-up comedian, only capable of making jokes at his wife's expense. And then, having commented on his wife's alleged inability to cook meat, Chris switched to her appearance, which in his opinion couldn't be improved with makeup, since it was ruined a long time ago. At that moment, Diana gave her friend a meaningful look, after which she got up from the table and went for the exit. Ashley understood everything without words and followed her. "Who does he think he is?" Diana exclaimed. Ashley winced but refrained from commenting. She understood that her friend's outrage was completely justified and therefore didn't feel like coming to her husband's defense. "You need to stand up to him," Diana said after a little thought. "What do you mean?" Ashley asked in surprise. "I mean that you need to put Chris in his place. Think of some story about him and share it at the table. We'll see how he'd like that," the woman explained with a smile. Of course, Ashley knew quite a few of Chris's secrets, but she didn't think it would be appropriate to share them with their guests. But since her husband didn't seem to feel the need to respect his wife, Ashley realized that it was time for her to stop holding it back. Meanwhile, Chris continued to amuse the audience with his jokes, which he believed were truly hilarious. He continued to make snide comments about Ashley's appearance, noting her excess weight and slightly bowed legs. Of course, Ashley knew that she looked fine and that every person had flaws, but not every person's husband made it their mission to point each of them out. Ashley clenched her fork in her hands until it hurt, then looked expressively into Chris's eyes, as if giving him one last chance. But her husband continued to laugh and rejoice at his own ingenuity, as if he wasn't doing anything wrong. Chris enjoyed being the life of the party, refusing to understand that he was humiliating his wife in the process. Deep down, Chris envied Ashley because she was so much smarter than him and was intuitively good at doing business. Meanwhile, he couldn't make a single decision without help from his wife, who did everything to ensure that the family business flourished and brought a stable income. That evening, Ashley couldn't find the courage to stand up to her husband. It wasn't until she left the restaurant that she asked Chris the uncomfortable question. "Why are you always making fun of me? Is it really so hard not to humiliate me in public?" Ashley asked with tears in her eyes. "Honey, why are you being like this? How am I humiliating you? I'm just joking around. Everyone understands that. You know how they say that laughter makes you live longer?" Chris answered as if nothing had happened. But Ashley didn't share her husband's carefree outlook on the situation. She felt that she could no longer forgive him for his behavior, and therefore she decided to prepare more thoroughly for the next family celebration. To do this, the young woman decided to pay closer attention to her husband and note all of his shortcomings, which were quite a few actually. Their family held all kinds of celebrations rather often, and this time, Ashley was ready to get back at her husband. The couple decided to hold the next gathering at home since the weather was great and they could spend time out in the yard. They invited many people over, and everyone was complimenting Ashley's culinary skills. In all fairness, it's worth saying that Ashley was a great cook and knew many tricks and hundreds of recipes. Cooking was actually a hobby of hers, and she spared no time and effort on it. Despite the compliments of the guests, Ashley didn't lose her vigilance and was ready for Chris's attacks. As she expected, it didn't take long. After drinking a glass of wine, Chris immediately let out a snide joke about the fact that Ashley could forget to use detergent when doing laundry. Trying not to burst out in tears, Ashley forced herself to smile and made a comment about the fact that Chris was a terrible slob. Moreover, Ashley did it so exquisitely that even Chris himself didn't immediately realize what was happening. Meanwhile, Ashley continued her verbal offensive. Also, Chris likes to leave things in the most unusual places. Just recently, he put a t-shirt on top of the closet and then proceeded to look for it for half the day. Ashley continued, imitating her husband's sarcastic tone. Chris only realized he was trapped when the guests burst into roaring laughter. All the guests used to see Chris as a successful businessman, but now he appeared before them in a completely different light. He was no longer the confident comedian who endlessly made jokes at his wife's expense. Chris's face clearly showed that Ashley's words hurt him. Technically, the young woman didn't cross any lines in her comments, and her husband understood it perfectly well. After all, it was Chris who always allowed himself to make exactly these kinds of jokes about Ashley. Diana clapped her hands loudly and laughed contagiously after each of her friend's jokes. She couldn't help but feel proud of her friend, who finally found the courage to stand up for herself. Chris, on the other hand, wasn't feeling all that excited about his wife's newfound confidence. He stayed quiet for most of the celebration and spent his time at the table staring at the screen on his phone. When the guests left, Chris went up to his wife and looked into her eyes. "Why are you doing this to me? Now all of our friends will make fun of me and point fingers at me." The man addressed his wife indignantly. Ashley smiled and said that she didn't see anything shameful in it. "Now we're both going to look funny in the eyes of our friends, but at least now it's fair to the both of us," Ashley answered as if nothing had happened. Only then did Chris realize that he was the one to blame for what was happening and not his wife, who always helped him in business and supported him in all other aspects of his life. After that memorable night, Chris stopped making jokes about Ashley, and if he did, it was only when they were alone. After Ashley taught him a lesson, Chris started appreciating his wife more. He loved his wife deeply and believed that their match was made in heaven. A year later, the couple had a beautiful baby, and after that, neither one of them had the time or the desire to joke around. Now, the young people were busy raising their son, supporting each other and making sure that their baby always had everything he needed.